I will not marry you. I am going to marry her instead. A billionaire shocks his own wedding guests by walking away from his beautiful bride at the altar, and choosing a dirty, barefoot homeless woman who showed up at the gates of his mansion on his wedding day. But when the guests find out who this woman really is, and what was done to her, nobody in that room can hold back their tears. Hello everyone, welcome to our story. Before we continue, please don't forget to like this video and subscribe to our channel. Also, tell us in the comments where you are watching from. Are you in New York? Jamaica? Maybe South Africa or Canada? We'd love to hear from you. Edward Blackwood was 34 years old on the morning of his wedding day. He stood at the bathroom mirror in his enormous bedroom and looked at his own face for a long time. Sharp jaw, dark eyes, broad shoulders inside a crisp white shirt that his valet had ironed and hung on the door the night before. He looked exactly like what he was, a powerful, wealthy, successful man who had everything the world said a man should want. So why did his chest feel so empty? He splashed cold water on his face and told himself it was just nerves. Normal wedding day nerves. Every man felt this way. He dried his face and walked to the window. His home, if you could call it a home, it was really more like a palace, sat on 2 acres of land in the most expensive part of the city. The garden below was already being prepared by a small army of workers in white uniforms. White flowers everywhere. Long tables covered in white cloth. A giant arch wrapped in roses standing at the far end of the garden, where the ceremony would happen in just a few hours. A red carpet ran from the gate all the way to the altar, as if royalty were expected. 300 guests were coming. Business people, politicians, celebrities, people whose names appeared in newspapers, people who would take photographs and share them everywhere so the whole world would know that Edward Blackwood had gotten married today. Edward watched the workers below and tried to feel something. He thought about Monica. They had been together for 4 years. She was beautiful, the kind of beautiful that made strangers stop and stare. She was sharp, and she knew how to move through important rooms and say the right things to the right people. She never embarrassed him. She was always perfectly dressed, always perfectly spoken, always exactly what was needed in any situation. Edward told himself this was love, or close enough to love. He had decided a long time ago that the real kind of love, the deep, terrifying, completely open kind, was not for him. Not anymore. He had tried it once. He had given his whole heart to one person without holding anything back at all. And she had taken that heart and destroyed it. Or so he had believed. He turned away from the window and began to get dressed. He did not think about Felicia. He never let himself think about Felicia. He was getting married today and everything was going to be fine. Down the hall, in the biggest guest suite in the mansion, Monica Adams had been awake since 5 in the morning. Not because she was nervous. Monica was never nervous. Nervousness was for people who weren't sure they were going to win. Monica was always sure. She sat at her wide vanity table in her silk robe while her makeup artist moved carefully across her face with a small brush. 3 other women were in the room with her. A hairstylist, a dress stylist who was steaming the wedding gown in the corner, and her personal assistant Ruth, who stood near the door with a clipboard, quiet and ready to fix any problem that came up. The room smelled of roses and expensive perfume. Monica stared at her reflection and thought about how far she had come. She had not grown up poor. But she had not grown up rich either. Somewhere in the middle. Her father had been an accountant. Her mother had been Margaret. And Margaret, more than anything else, had made Monica exactly who she was. Margaret Adams was not like other mothers. Other mothers told their daughters things like work hard and be kind and find someone who loves you for who you are. Margaret told Monica different things. She told her that the world was a competition, and only the smartest players won. She told her that beauty was a tool, useful but only if you knew how to use it. She told her that feelings were expensive and mostly useless, and that the cleverest thing a woman could do was choose her goals carefully, plan everything quietly, and never let emotion get in the way. Monica had been an excellent student. By the time she was 16, she could walk into a room and immediately know who had power, who wanted it, and who was pretending. By 18, she knew exactly the kind of life she wanted. And she was already working on how to get it. Then at university, she had seen Edward Blackwood. She had known who he was before she ever spoke to him. Everyone did. He was the Blackwood heir, quiet, serious, a little guarded, but with the kind of presence that filled a room without trying. She had watched him carefully for weeks before making her first move. But then something unexpected happened. Before Monica could get close to him, Edward had fallen for someone else. Felicia. Monica's jaw tightened slightly under the makeup brush and the artist said softly, "Please keep still, ma'am." Monica relaxed her face and smoothed her expression back to calm. Felicia. Plain, simple, scholarship student Felicia, with her worn-out shoes and her second-hand textbooks and her big brown eyes that Edward could not stop looking at. Monica had watched the two of them together and felt something she did not have a name for at the time, something hot and sharp that sat deep in her chest and refused to leave. Later she understood it was rage. And rage, her mother had always taught her, was just energy waiting to be used. Margaret Adams arrived at the mansion at 8 o'clock in the morning, exactly as planned. She was 60 years old, but she carried herself like a woman who had never once doubted herself in her life. Silver hair, gray eyes, a cream-colored dress that was elegant without trying too hard. She moved through the busy corridors of the mansion with a small, satisfied smile on her face. The smile of a person watching a plan they set in motion a very long time ago finally reach its end. She knocked twice on the door of Monica's suite and entered without waiting for an answer. "You look perfect," she said, standing behind Monica and examining her reflection in the mirror. "I know," Monica said. "Don't cry during the ceremony. It smudges everything and makes you look weak." "I won't cry." "Good." Margaret lowered her voice, even though there was no one nearby who could hear. "Once you've signed, it's over. Everything is yours. Nothing and nobody can undo it." Monica met her mother's eyes in the mirror. Between them passed the kind of look that didn't need words. The look of two people who had worked toward the same thing for a very long time and were finally standing at the finish line. "Yes, Mother," Monica said. Margaret nodded once, then turned to look out the window at the garden below. Everything was exactly as it should be. Everything was under control. She liked things under control. She was very, very good at keeping them that way. At the front gate of the mansion, a woman sat on the ground. She was thin. Her clothes were old and faded. Her feet were bare and dirty, her shoes having fallen apart weeks ago. Her hair was uncombed, and she had a small plastic bag beside her that held everything she owned in the world. She had been sitting there since before sunrise, when the city was still dark and quiet. Her name was Felicia. She was 32 years old, though she looked older. The streets do that to a person. They take the softness out of your face and replace it with something harder. But if you looked carefully, past the dust and the tired eyes and the worn-out clothes, you could still see something in her face that the years had not been able to take away. A kind of quiet, determined strength. Something that was still alive in her, even after everything. She watched the long black cars pulling through the gate one by one. She watched the guests stepping out in their fine clothes, laughing and greeting each other. She watched the guards at the gate checking names off a list before letting each person through. Her name was not on any list, but she had to get inside. She had to speak to Edward Blackwood before this wedding happened. She had been trying to build up the courage for 3 days. She had walked across most of the city to be here. Her feet were sore and her stomach was empty, but none of that mattered right now, because Felicia knew something that nobody else in that mansion knew. Something that had been buried for 10 long years under money and lies, and the cold, careful planning of people who believed they had gotten away with everything. She had the proof. And today was the only day it still mattered. She stood up, picked up her small plastic bag and walked to the gate. "Stop right there." One of the security guards stepped in front of her. He was a large man in a black uniform, and he looked at her the way many people looked at her these days, not with cruelty exactly, but with the flat, tired look of someone who has already decided what kind of person they are dealing with before hearing a single word. "I need to speak with Mr. Blackwood," Felicia said. Her voice was quiet, but she kept it steady. "Mr. Blackwood is getting married today. He's not available. Please, just pass a message. Tell him someone from Greenfield University is here. Tell him it's urgent. He will want to know." The guard looked her up and down slowly. Then he shook his head. "You need to move away from the gate. Please? Ma'am?" His voice dropped to a warning tone. "Move away from the gate now or I'm calling the police." Felicia stood still for one long moment. Through the iron bars of the gate, she could see the white chairs being filled with guests. She could see the flower arch at the end of the red carpet, where Edward would soon be standing. She stepped back. But she did not leave. She sat back down on the ground beside the wall, just out of the guard's direct sight. She pulled her knees to her chest, wrapped her arms around them and waited. She would find another way. She always found another way. Thomas was looking for his phone. He patted his jacket pocket, his trouser pockets, the small table by the window. Nothing. He was Edward's best friend, had been since they were both 11 years old and sitting next to each other in school because their last names both started with B. He was shorter than Edward, with a round open face that was almost always smiling. He was wearing a gray suit and had already loosened his tie even though it was barely 8:30 in the morning. He stepped out into the corridor and nearly walked straight into a young kitchen worker carrying a tray. "Sorry," he said, steadying the tray. "No, sir, I'm sorry." The young woman hesitated. "Sir? I don't know if I should say anything, but there's a woman at the front gate. She's been there since before sunrise. The guards keep sending her away, but she keeps coming back." Thomas frowned. "What does she want?" "She says she needs to speak to Mr. Blackwood. She looks like she's been living on the streets for a while. The guards didn't take her seriously, but I heard what she said before they pushed her back, sir." The young woman paused. "She mentioned Greenfield University." Thomas went very still. Greenfield University. That was where Edward had studied. That was where, a long time ago, everything had gone so wrong. A cold, quiet feeling moved through his chest. "Where is she now?" he asked carefully. "Still outside the gate, sir. She won't leave." Thomas straightened his jacket. "Don't say anything to anyone," he said quietly. "I'll go myself." He walked down the long corridor toward the front of the mansion, his footsteps quick and purposeful, the cold feeling in his chest growing with every step. Thomas walked out of the mansion's front door and down the long driveway toward the gate. The morning sun was already warm on his face. Around him, staff members hurried back and forth carrying flowers and folding chairs and boxes of things he couldn't identify. Nobody paid him any attention. Everyone had their own job to do this morning. He reached the gate and looked through the iron bars. She was sitting against the wall just to the right, small, thin, her knees pulled up to her chest, her head slightly bowed. She had a plastic bag next to her that looked like it weighed almost nothing. Thomas cleared his throat. The woman looked up. For a moment Thomas just stood there. He had not seen Felicia in 10 years. 10 years was a long time. Long enough to change a person so completely that you might walk past them on the street and feel nothing but a vague, unsettled feeling, like you had forgotten something important but couldn't remember what. But Thomas remembered. He remembered her laugh. He remembered the way she used to sit cross-legged on the grass outside the university library with 3 textbooks open at the same time. He remembered how Edward used to look at her, like she was the most interesting thing in any room she walked into. He remembered the morning everything fell apart. He stared at her now and felt something twist painfully in his stomach. The woman looking back at him through the gate had Felicia's eyes. The same shape, the same quiet intelligence behind them. But everything else had been worn down by time and hardship. Her cheeks thinner, her skin duller, her whole body folded in on itself in the careful way of someone who had learned to take up as little space as possible. "Felicia," he said. His voice came out lower than he intended, almost a whisper. She blinked. Then something moved across her face, surprise, relief, and something else. Something guarded. "Thomas," she said softly. They looked at each other through the bars of the gate for a long, heavy moment. "How long have you been out here?" he asked. "Since before the sun came up." Thomas looked back toward the mansion, then back at her. His mind was moving quickly, turning things over. He thought about Edward inside, getting dressed. He thought about Monica in her wedding gown. He thought about 300 guests who would start arriving in earnest within the hour. He thought about how Edward had been for the past 10 years, successful, respected, always composed, and underneath all of it, somehow never quite whole. "I need to speak to him," Felicia said. Her voice was quiet and steady, but there was an urgency underneath it, pressed down tight. "I know today is the worst possible day. I know how this looks. But Thomas, I have something he needs to see before this wedding happens. Please." Thomas studied her face. In all the years he had known Edward, he had watched his friend slowly close himself off from the world. One lock at a time. One wall at a time. He had watched him choose Monica, not with joy, not with the nervous, lit-up energy of a man in love, but with the calm, careful logic of a man who had decided that safety was the best he could hope for. Thomas had never fully believed the story about Felicia's betrayal. Not completely. Something about it had always sat wrong with him, too neat, too convenient, too perfectly timed. But he had been young, and Edward had been so certain, and there had been no proof of anything else. Until now, maybe. "Wait here," Thomas said. He turned and walked back toward the mansion. Getting Felicia through the gate turned out to be easier than Thomas expected, mostly because he said nothing to anyone and simply opened the small side entrance himself, waving off the guard who started to protest with a look that said very clearly, "I am the groom's best friend and I am not in the mood." He led her quickly along the edge of the garden, away from the main areas where the staff were still setting up, keeping to the path that ran alongside the tall hedge. Felicia walked beside him in silence, her bare feet on the smooth stone path. She kept her eyes down, and Thomas noticed the way she moved, carefully, quietly,